So, comedy and tragedy in a nutshell. This is our drama in a nutshell. It's very literal, drama in a nutshell. But we're going to talk about just a little bit about tragedy and comedy, just in general, very, very in general. And then I'm going to go through the three types of heroes. The adventure hero, which is just the general overall hero trope, I guess. And then our archetype. And then the tragic hero and the flawed hero. All right, so let's talk about tragedy in general. What is tragedy? What do we consider tragedy when we're talking about plays, when we're talking about writing, when we're talking about movies, which is more likely how you may come across it now. Tragedy is drama in which a major character undergoes a loss. But it doesn't just mean you cried. It doesn't just mean somebody died, because the major character has to undergo loss, but also achieves illumination or a new perspective. So we'll kind of come back to this when we get to the tragic hero. It's considered the most elevated form of drama. It always has been. It still is. This is why normally when you watch, if any of you watch or pay attention to like Academy Awards, often what wins the Academy Awards is high drama, which is often tinged heavily with tragedy. Aristotle's definition of tragedy was, in quotes, an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of certain magnitude. In other words, there's that elevated. It's above other things. So not comedy. It's definitely not going to have comedy in it. In language, it's embellished with each kind of artistic action. That's why a lot of serious actors have been part of tragedies. Not of narrative, though pity and fear affect the proper purgation of these emotions. So we're going to come back to this line. Pity and fear affecting the proper purgation of these emotions is what's called catharsis. So catharsis is a major element of tragedy overall. That word's going to reappear when we get to the tragic hero. So I don't want to cover it twice. So I'm just going to talk about it right here. So when that word comes back up in a couple slides under tragic hero, I'm not going to rediscuss it. So I'm going to discuss it here. What in the heck does catharsis mean? It's probably one of the most important elements of what makes tragedy important, why tragedy is considered elevated, why tragedy is considered so much higher than other forms of writing and drama and whatever, and why it wins all the Academy Awards often, or it has a piece of the Academy Awards. So catharsis means it uses this word purgation we saw right here. So purgation, like purging, which, like if you purge something, or you've purged yourself, or you've gotten rid of, it sounds like throwing up or something. And in some way that is how that works. So catharsis is part of this process that Aristotle felt that human beings, we would be very logical and very reasonable as a species if it wasn't for these darn emotions, right? If it wasn't for the fact that we feel emotions, we would be perfect. Now we sound like, Spock or something. So if you think about probably most bad decisions you've ever made, or anything stupid that you've ever done, every regret that you've ever had, probably all of those things revolved around making a decision or doing something based on some kind of emotion. Either you were angry, so you had this, emotion, overly emphasized emotion of anger, or you were jealous, or you were really, really distraught and sad, or you were super head over heels, mushy in love or something, right? So you made these decisions based on an overabundance of some kind of an emotion, right? They had an emotional basis to them. And later on, we're like, if only I would have been more clear-headed at the time, I would have seen that was not a good thing to do. If I would have been more clear-headed, I would have made a different decision. Well, hindsight is 20/20, right? And the reason we can say that is because we can look back and we now see that the path was stupid because we already screwed it up. but also because when sometimes your decisions are colored by heavily by emotions, it's very, very difficult to use logic when you're really angry or when you're deeply emotionally, saddened, or when you're really, really in love with somebody and they ask you to do something. So our emotions cloud our judgment. So it was believed, and still is heavily an idea of tragedy. Aristotle believed that if we had a way to release those emotions, he thought that as human beings that we reached a certain point where those emotions got really heavy. And we still use this language today, right? We've reached a breaking point. We needed to have a release at the end of the week. We needed to blow off some steam, right? So we still use all of this language that indicates that we even still believe that we have a set amount of space in our body for our emotions before they boil over and something bad happens. So Aristotle felt that that was true, and that there had to be a way for us to do just that, to blow off that steam, to get rid of those extra emotions, to effectively properly purge ourself of emotions. That's what this means. Pity and fear could effectively, properly purge ourself of emotions. And he felt that that could happen by watching tragedy. He thought not like going around and watching planes crash and cars get into accidents, but by watching plays. At the time, of course, Aristotle, they didn't have TV. So they were watching, Greek tragedy. That if a Greek tragedy was done well, that the audience would be heavily invested into the characters, and that we would experience the pain of the characters, experience the loss of the characters, and that we would be deeply affected by what happened to the characters as we watched it unfold in front of us. And at the end, we would be frustrated, we would be saddened, we would be disgusted or whatever, and we would properly purge ourselves of all of the extra emotions that had been building up through the month or the year or however long it took between us going and watching these plays, right? So to him, if people would go and watch tragedies more often, we could purge ourselves of these extra emotions, and then we could walk around on a daily basis and make much, much more sound decisions, because even though we would start building up new emotions, we had at least kind of had a safety valve opened up and gotten rid of the extra emotions. That's what he felt tragedy did, which in his mind would save humanity. I mean, that's a pretty lofty agenda for a play, which is why it was so highly esteemed. Okay, so catharsis would be like crying your eyes out or being extremely angry to see that something happened in a story. And we do get attached to the characters in our stories, and we do get attached and feel disturbed by things that happen in movies when we watch them. So we are affected when we watch things and they make us feel upset or angry or disturbed or ticked off. Even when you read things on Facebook, people are affected by what we hear, by what we see, by what we read. So catharsis is a real thing. Now, sometimes it doesn't purge us, though, of how we feel. Sometimes it just makes us feel angrier. So there's definitely a line. So he felt that tragedy was made, it could be feeling cathartic meant, oof, that really made me feel like I released something and I feel so much better now. It's why we have language like a good cry, which sounds like a weird thing. How can you have a good cry? Crying sounds like a terrible thing to me. But a good cry is just sometimes just releasing it. Okay, so enough conversation about catharsis. But the next time you hear that, catharsis, or it's cathartic for you, it just means purging yourself of all of these negative emotions. So the tragic plot usually includes multiple things: reversal of situation, recognition, and the scene of suffering. So there's usually a point where the hero, which we'll see in just a second, has a point where he flip-flops, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, where the whole situation turns upside down, a point of recognition where in a real tragedy and in a real tragic plot, the true hero, and this is what makes him a hero in a tragic plot, recognizes his part in the tragedy. Instead of blaming everybody else, which is not what a hero would do. That's what a coward would do. In a hero situation, a tragic hero situation, there's a moment when the hero recognizes that regardless of other things spinning out of control, and regardless of that some of the things were not his fault and the situation, just spun around, that he himself or she herself did have a part to play in the events that happened. So there's this moment of recognition of how they themselves could have stopped this from being a tragedy, and they take responsibility. Then there's a scene of suffering where something terrible happens to them. Okay, so that's kind of the nuts and bolts of tragedy. The absolute biggest thing is that it's elevated. It creates this whole idea of catharsis, and it has these main elements of reversal of situation, of recognition, and scene of suffering. There's way more to it, but that's why we're doing it, in a nutshell. Comedy is a little bit different. It was never considered something that was elevated. It was always considered something that was beneath everybody. But, the truth is that comedy could be also a relief valve as well, right? In some ways, I think comedy could also be cathartic. You could laugh, right? Laughter is good medicine too. You could laugh and find that release just as well. Comedy involves patterns of humorous or comic actions that make up a story. It could be ordinary or fantastic, so it has much more possibilities, but they're always solvable and correctable, unlike tragedy where they don't end well. Patterns could be dialogue, or it could be activity. They could be serious problems, or they could be dangerous problems. They could be amusing or entertaining, and they're often instructive. And there's different types of comedy. There's high comedy, so it just depends on what you like. And there's just many different levels of comedy. I'm kind of a more high comedy fan, but then there's, like, my dad likes slapstick comedy. So high comedy is more like, if you like romantic comedies, then you're probably more of a high comedy fan. Comedy of manners are things that sometimes have a more serious tone to them, but they often still have elements of romance to them. Satire comedy is still considered high comedy because it's verbal. It's a type of comedy where what's funny about it is the conversation of it. It's all involving the dialogue. Like, you can, it's stuff that last year when I had eye surgery several months back, and I couldn't actually watch any TV while I was stuck on the couch with, like, eye patches on. It was really, really boring a couple of weeks. So we put in movies that were like high comedy because I didn't actually have to see anything, but I could listen. And it really helped because it was really all about the dialogue. So what was funny was listening to what they were saying. Shakespeare comedies are satiric comedies and comedies of manners, where you could listen to them and you don't really have to see anything. There's not a lot to watch. You could just listen to the dialogue. So high comedy has a lot more to do with, some of it's situational, but it's also a lot about what they're saying and doing. Low comedy has a lot more to do with what's actually happening, the situation, like the falling and the tumbling and the smacking around of people and the, I don't know, the running in circles. Think Three Stooges here, Will Ferrell movies, Jim Carrey movies, right? Those are farcical, kind of silly. At the top half of this, they may include a little bit of both, some dialogue silliness and some running around silliness. So they may still have some elements of both here. So they may be farce where it's a little bit of puns and so a little bit of pun, dialogue, fun, and farcical where they're mocking other things. Like when they make fun of the scary movies, like the scary movie whole thing where they make fun of other scary movies. That's kind of more farcical. But they're also being silly, so it's a lot of body humor, like exaggerated movement and face gestures and stuff like that. Slapstick is just full on exactly what it sounds like smacking each other and running around and getting hit with paint cans and smacked with sticks and falling off and just craziness of that sort of thing. That's like straight up just Three Stooges stuff right here. But, you know, a lot of people find that really funny and relaxing. And if it was a more serious situation, it would be awful. But because it's in a comedy situation, we laugh at it. Comedy of the absurd or dark comedy. If you don't know what it is and it doesn't seem funny to you, it will never seem funny to you. So I could explain it till I was blue in the face and it would never make sense to you. And that may say something really good about you. If you get dark comedy and you like dark comedy, that just puts you in the weird person club. Welcome to it, because I'm a big fan of it. I love dark comedy. It's a strange thing, and it's kind of you get it and like it or you don't, and it's hard to kind of put your thumb on it. Good examples of dark comedy. I know I always have way too old of examples for dark comedy. Pulp Fiction's kind of dark comedy. Quentin Tarantino movies in general are examples of dark comedy. Thinking. The Barber of Seville. Sweeney Todd, dark comedy. Really, really dark comedy. Kind of things like that. There's other examples, but I mean, those come to the top of my head. They're peculiar. They're not funny, like laugh out loud, like, haha, that was so silly. It's not silly. There's nothing silly about them. They're usually get on the side of being almost horrific, but there's something funny about that. Not funny. There's something entertainingly and peculiar about the situation that they're in and almost ridiculous about the situation that makes them entertaining in a peculiar sort of way. Like they're absurd. They're almost just ridiculous in the situation. All right. So kind of slipping through the different types of heroes, which has to directly do with the assignment that's attached to this, is just looking at the three types. Just like the basic hero, which sometimes they'll call the adventure hero or just the hero, which has to do with most regular adventure tales that you'll see, or basic hero movies, adventure hero movies that you'll see. And then there's a tragic hero, and then there's the flawed hero, which is probably something you've seen more and more recently, becoming more the norm rather than the pure good adventure hero, tragic hero types of archetypes. So a regular, just basic hero archetype would be that, you know, there was a quote from Joseph Campbell said that all cultures have a hero story and a hero archetype, regardless of what type of culture background we're talking about. And there's a basic structured path that they all kind of come from. So this doesn't mean that any kind of movie that you're going to watch is going to have all of these, but this is kind of a basic structure. It's called the hero's journey, and we're still talking about like the adventure hero or the basic hero. They also call it an archetype or a monomyth, and we're calling it the hero's journey here. And this, you may recognize elements of this in the movie you're watching. So let's say you watch a movie and you're like, oh, I'm going to use this one for the assignment. And I'm like, okay, so if you're going to say that your story or your movie that you're watching uses the adventure hero style, then you should be able to pick out a few of these, because I think I asked you for 3 that came out of here. Not all 10 of them or however many there are, but just at least 3, all right, that you like, well, they started off in the ordinary world. So the first one is the heroes are introduced in the ordinary world, a place that's comfortable but boring. So, I mean, this is just a picture from one of the Hobbit movies, because they always seem to start off in the Hobbit Shire. So whatever movie you're talking about, it doesn't need to be a Hobbit movie. It doesn't matter what type of movie it is. Any adventure movie, they'll usually start off in their comfy place. Indiana Jones movies, he starts off in a classroom often, or at home. Star Wars movies start off back at the farm, in the first, when the first set came out. They'll start off back at home, like in their comfy place. They'll start off in the ordinary world, the place that's comfortable but boring, and then they'll receive some kind of quote-unquote call to adventure. Somebody shows up on their doorstep, usually a stranger often, that something happens and they're kind of brought into this new situation where they need to get involved. But, number 3, they're often reluctant to get involved. They'll often even flat out refuse to get involved. They don't want to go. They're comfortable here in their Hobbit Shire. They're comfortable in their home. They're comfortable in their ordinary world. They don't want to go. They don't know what's out there, right? They don't want to go. Number 4 says they're encouraged by some kind of a mentor, whether it's Obi-Wan or it's, whoever, may really kind of push them. It's like, oh, but you're special. Oh, but somebody else thinks you're special too. You have special power, or you have a special gift, or whatever. Who gives them a special item or an ancient weapon? It may be a ring, right? One ring to rule them all. It may be a book. It may be a pair of glasses. It may be a lightsaber. And then they cross the first threshold and enter the special world. So that first threshold is basically them stepping outside their own door, them going, okay, I'm gonna step outside of my comfort zone and go out into the world. That's the first threshold. Usually when they go outside their comfort zone, they go encounter their initial tests, their initial allies. They usually will meet up with some initial friends and create their initial group, and they'll come across their initial enemies as Indiana Jones. And number 7 says, then they may approach the innermost cave. It doesn't mean it's a literal cave. In this case it was. But they have to prepare for battle. So there's usually a bigger battle that's different than their initial little kind of tests. There's kind of a bigger battle coming that may be a literal battle, like fighting with swords or something, or it may be something that's more personal on the inside. And that's the second threshold. It's a bigger test that they have to go through. The innermost cave, they endure some kind of an ordeal. That's that second threshold where they have to go through some kind of an ordeal. It may be mental, it may be physical. Then they take possession of some kind of a reward. At that point, usually in the movie or the story, you think it may be over, but it's usually not. And I usually think it's over, and I'll pause my Netflix and look and say, oh, we're only like 3/4 through the movie, so clearly we're not done yet. And at that point, what happens is you think it's over, but it's not, and they're often pursued back to the ordinary world. That's when you think they're about done, but they're really not, and they've brought back the bad guys to their quiet little shire, or back to their base, or back to their home, and all hell breaks loose. So something bad happens, and this is like this next big step. The cross to the third threshold. They experience something really, it's a huge battle usually. They get close to death, or somebody close to them does, or they do, or their whole land almost dies. And then there's some kind of a resurrection. It doesn't mean a literal resurrection. It doesn't mean they died and came back to life, but they're transformed somehow by the experience. They've grown up, they've matured, they've realized they have a bigger part to play in their life. Then they return, and it's over to that with some kind of magic elixir, which does not have to be literal, and or treasure that will benefit everybody. It's not just for them. They don't get some prize that's just for them. They usually, something that they return with will benefit everybody, whether that's a power to help everybody, or they've freed their land from everybody, or they've killed something that will help the world, or whatever, right? Because in these adventure tales, it always comes down to them saving the world or something like that. So those are kind of those 12 big steps. So it doesn't mean they're all going to be in there. In fact, most of the time they're not all there, but you will recognize some of them if that's the type of story you're watching. And if that's, you're going to tell me, oh, the movie I watched definitely had the adventure hero. Okay, well, if it was an adventure hero, you should be able to recognize at least 3 of these items inside of it. And that's all you need to be able to get across to me, is how you recognize these 3 items in your movie. All right, so the difference between that kind of hero and a tragic hero, well, usually in the tragic hero, everybody dies. So let's look at it more detailed. So I'm skipping this one, and let's talk about it more specifically. So in the tragic hero, the hero usually didn't come from just the little hobbit in the Hobbit Shire. In a tragic hero, the tragic hero usually comes from a higher space, okay? The tragic hero usually was more from an exalted position. Now, it used to be like in a Shakespeare tragedy, that meant that they were the king or the prince or something. But in modern movies and tragedies, that just usually means they were the CEO, or they had a lot of money, or they had their own business, or they were like this high-end tech guy, whatever. They were at the top of their game, whatever that was, okay? So they were in some kind of top position where they had it all, so to speak, okay? The reason they have to be at the top is because in order for them to be a tragic hero, they have to be able to fall. So the tragic hero is also going to have a fatal flaw. Tragic heroes usually are good guys that have screwed up and come down to a bad place. They started off good. They're not bad guys. They're not the bad guy in the story. They were a good guy at some point that have become twisted because of a fatal flaw. All right? Even though later on in the series, Gollum is not good, and later on in the series, Anakin Skywalker becomes Darth Vader. But early on, they weren't the bad guys. Early on, they were heroes in these series of movies, if you know the series. They are tragic. They're tragic heroes because they had personality traits that were admirable in small doses, especially Anakin Skywalker. In the beginning of the series, he is very good at what he does. He has a lot of power, and he has a lot of ambition. Ambition in small doses is something that can be a good thing. We tell people they should have ambition. We tell people, oh, you should have pride in what you do. You should have pride in the things that you are good at. But too much pride is always a fatal flaw in these stories. Too much ambition turns to sour things, and it turns into greed, which is what happened. Too much love can turn into greed. Too much love and ambition and pride, which was Anakin Skywalker. Too much love turned into greed for Gollum, which he was a hobbit once, and then turned into this nasty thing. So he was literally changed physically, and of course so was Anakin Skywalker to become Darth Vader. So they were physically altered as well as on the inside. later, but initially they were heroes that became tragic heroes and suffered great losses. So flaws, their initial things that were good, pride, ambition, and even love, were turned into something extremely ugly because they were taken too far. So those become their fatal flaws. All right. So a fatal flaw turns into something bad. So we already talked about catharsis. Experience right before their fall, a tragic hero will experience catharsis, the sudden understanding of their folly, a sudden understanding of their mistakes that they have made, where they're like, oops, I really screwed this up. But it usually happens right before they die, which is why they're tragic. Because if they realized it and then could fix it, it wouldn't be a tragedy, right? They don't get a chance to fix anything, which is why they're tragic heroes, and which is why it causes people to feel sad and have that moment of purgation in that catharsis moment, because we will understand a long ways before the main character does how they have screwed up terribly before they really understand it. So there comes a moment where the tragic hero does understand the mistakes that they have made and all of the horrible things that have happened because of their mistakes. But they usually only understand them right before they die. Like Romeo, like Hamlet, like Anakin Skywalker / Darth Vader realizes it right before he dies. All of them realize it almost always right before they die. Yeah, it's unfortunate. So the fall, that was Romeo with Juliet and Darth Vader. In order for the tragic hero's journey to be complete, they must experience a fall. They either lose all of their power, all of their prestige, all of their money, all of their objects of their affection, or their life. Usually they lose all of these things. If they didn't have a fall, they would just be a hero, right? And we wouldn't learn anything from their mistakes. So the fall means a loss of everything, and that's usually when they have that moment of realization and take responsibility. All right, so that was the tragic hero. So if you're going to say what you're watching was a movie that included in it a tragic hero, just because you're watching something, it doesn't, and has a tragic hero in it. Darth Vader was a tragic hero, but Star Wars was not a tragedy, but it certainly had a tragic hero in it. Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy. It's a tragic play with tragic heroes in it. But just because there's a tragic hero doesn't mean it's a tragedy, and vice versa. So you can kind of make up your mind on how you feel about that. You just need to be able to tell me what elements it had in it that tell me why you felt it was a tragic hero. And the last one, and I'm almost done. We have tragic heroes, we have regular heroes, but what if they're not quite either one of those? This newer kind of hero archetype on the ground here that we've had more and more and more of has been a flawed hero. A lot of stories more recently have been using the flawed hero. He's not 100% good, shiny, knight in shining armor of perfection and awesomeness, but he's also not this extremely messed up, broken down, tragic hero that dies at the end because he's so broken. We get somebody in between, this flawed hero, broken, but did something good and doesn't die. So the tragic heroes have deep vices, can truly sin, while we all know that flawed heroes are always the good guys no matter what they do. So we get this weird thing going on in the middle that becomes confusing. So tragic heroes were like Hamlet, Romeo, Anakin Skywalker, Willy Loman, if you're in Death as a Salesman. Flawed heroes might be more like Riddick from the Chronicles of Riddick. Or if you, what did somebody just tell me? Or Dexter, or Breaking Bad. I mean, we get these like flawed heroes where you find yourself reading something or watching something and you're rooting for this person who becomes like this hero figure in the story or the movie that's actually helping others in some weird kind of way, and you want them to be the person that comes out on top and wins, but they're not perfect. They're not the knight in shining armor. They're not the person that's doing all the right things, but they are trying to do better and they are trying to help others, but they're kind of messed up. Some of them are really messed up. I mean, Riddick is, a serial killer, but, then he comes back and tries to save an entire world of people. So, I mean, the flawed hero will always come out on top. They'll always win the day. But the tragic hero will have a major downfall. And the flawed hero has downfalls too. And they often end up, alone, and they may not come out in the best shape, and they may not get everything, but they always try to come back out fighting and working towards something. It may just not always be in all the best ways, and you wouldn't call them like a hero, like the good guy that always does all the good things. So it's a confusing type of hero. So they're kind of flawed. It's kind of like if anybody watched Suicide Squad. It was a weird thing. They were all the really messed up bad guys from other genres. Well, I mean from the same genre, but they took up all the bad guys from before and then they dumped them in. So now you're rooting for what was before the bad guys. It was just a weird thing. So they're flawed. But they're doing something and you want them to succeed all of a sudden. It can be a confusing thing, so you're not always sure what their reasoning is or what their motive is for doing what they do sometimes, but yet you're on their side, at least for the time you're watching the movie. So whatever it is you're going to say, I watched this movie, you have to tell me the movie or whatever. I think they're flawed. I think they're more the adventure regular hero brand, or I think they're the tragic hero. Then you need to back it up and tell me why. So we'll look at those types.